Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be continuing with the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Today, talking about Chapter 2, How Your Habits Shape Your Identity. We kind of touched on this a little bit last time, but in Chapter 1, the previous video, we discussed more in depth on what the book will be about. We talked about how goals usually don't follow a linear pattern, like you do one thing and then you get 1% better. It's usually a valley, or kind of like a logarithmic, or more like a quadratic function on a graph. So it's not just a straight line. Think about, you do one thing, you go up one and then across one. It's usually a valley, and the valley we talked about was the plateau of latent potential, where nothing seems to be working or happening, even though you're practicing every single day. But then finally, you break through one day. We use the example of the ice cube, how it melts at a certain temperature, and even the 1 degree before 32 degrees or 33 degrees Fahrenheit at which it, or Celsius at which it melts, nothing happens. But then you increase it by that just 1 degree and then it just melts. And that's how goals are achieved. And we talked about some of the problems when people set goals, is that people tend to think, oh, I'm going to set the same goal as a successful person, but winners and losers have the same goals. We talked about, once you achieve a goal, the problem with that is that now that you've achieved it, that there's nothing to do after it. So you kind of falter, or you fall back to your previous habits. Goals, how we talked about how goals can potentially impact your happiness, because if you don't achieve them, then you consider yourself a failure. So we talked about all that in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, we're going to talk about how you shouldn't really be outcomes based. You shouldn't be focused on making goals. You should be focused on your identity. What do I mean by that? And with that, we can just go ahead and start with Chapter 2. So, changing habits is challenging, says James Clear. And they're challenging for two reasons, because according to James, we try to change the wrong thing, and then also we try to change our habits in the wrong way. So we try to change the wrong thing, and then we try to change it in the wrong way. And James says that there's 3 levels at which change occurs. So this is working from outer to inner. So there's outcomes based changes, which is basically when you say, I want to lose weight, or I want to get an A on the next exam. That's an outcome. So that's at the very outer level. Next level in would be process level change, which is where you want to change the system of behavior. So instead of saying, I want to lose weight, which is like an event, an outcome, process would be, okay, I want to eat less sugary foods, or I want to eat less meals at nighttime. Things like that. That's a process level change. That's a process level goal. The most innermost level is the identity portion. And this is going to be the most important part of atomic habits, of changing who you are, of getting the outcomes that you want in life, is this identity, which is very similar to what we talked about in Lanny Basham's book with Winning in Mind. So the identity portion is saying, I am athletic, or I am an in shape person, or I am a person who is at a optimal BMI, something like that. These are the 3 levels at which change occurs. And what James says, sorry, there we go, next slide. And what James says is that everything that you set forth in your life to do should start from the identity level, and it works its way out on its own. You shouldn't start with the outcomes. You should start with your identity and say to yourself, hey, what would a person do who is skinny, who is at an optimal BMI, who is an athlete, what would they do? So James continues on and he says, you don't want to start with what you want to achieve. You want to start with what you want to become. So you set goals based on your belief structure and your identity, not on the outcome. So instead of saying, hey, I want to make it my goal to quit smoking, you should instead say, hey, I want to become a non-smoker. And then every other behavior from that identity statement becomes, starts to become reality, basically. Because you can make an outcome-based goal, but it oftentimes doesn't stick. And we talked about the problems with goals in the first chapter, but behavior that's incongruent with yourself won't last. So yes, you can quit smoking and you can go, 5 days a week, 2 weeks without smoking. But if you don't consider yourself a non-smoker or a healthy person, then you're going to eventually go back to smoking because the behavior is incongruent with your self-identity because, hey, you probably have smoked for a long, long time. It's been ingrained in your identity. And just because you go a couple days without smoking doesn't mean that you are not a smoker. So there's an intrinsic motivation to all this where you do something for so long that the habit ends up becoming your identity. But also, conversely, if habits don't align with your identity, you stop doing them. So if you say to yourself, oh, I want to get an A on that exam, but you're a C-level student and that's kind of been your identity all throughout school, then, well, the habits won't stick. You're not going to stick to studying because being a C student is all you know. Versus if you start with the fact in mind, hey, I am a very successful student. I am a 3.8 GPA student. Now the behaviors that you do or don't do, maybe if you don't do certain behaviors, it interferes with that identity, and then you start to do the correct behaviors. You say to yourself, hey, I'm a 3.8 GPA student, and all of a sudden throughout the day, if you're not taking time out of your day to study, it becomes incongruent with your identity, which makes you want to study, to not make you seem like, hey, I'm lying to myself. If you guys see what I'm saying there. So let's continue forward. And then, last point there. At some point, you are no longer pursuing behavior change. You simply act like the person you are becoming. And that's really the goal here, is to change, again, like I mentioned earlier, it's to change your identity and to then align habits with your identity. That should be your focus, not goals or outcomes, an outcomes-based approach. So James continues on. There's 2 steps to changing your identity. And again, this is going to be the most effective way to create more positive habits for yourself. Identity comes from the Latin assentitas and identidum, which means being repeatedly. So your identity is who you are repeatedly. You've probably heard quotes like this before. You are your habits or something like that. But there's 2 steps. So 2 steps to changing your identity. First, you have to decide the type of person you want to become. And then the second one is you have to prove it to yourself with small wins. So you could say to yourself, hey, I'm deciding that I'm the kind of computer programmer who looks for better solutions to problems. So now what are you going to do to reinforce this identity? Well, you're going to take time out of the day to study data structures and algorithms. You're going to take time out of your day to understand time complexity, space complexity with algorithms and the code that you're working with. You're going to better understand how to find more efficient solutions and better sorting and searching algorithms that work better for your code, etc. And everything's downstream for that. James says once you decide who you are, you work to reinforce that identity, and then it becomes a feedback loop. So the identity shapes your habits shape your identity, and vice versa, back and forth. In summary, I know this was a pretty short chapter, but I think this really sets the tone for the rest of the book and what we're going to be talking about. In summary, there's 3 levels of change. So we talked about there are outcomes, there are process, and identity levels of change. And outcomes at the very outer edge, identities at the inner, more intrinsic to you. So there's 3 levels of change, and the most effective way to get atomic habits or get change in your life is to change your identity or how you see yourself or your beliefs. We talked about how you want to focus on what you want to become, not on what you want to do. And then when you do that, your identity becomes formed from the actions you take to reinforce that identity. So in a way, you're not really achieving a goal. And again, this is kind of the problems that we talked about with goals in the beginning or in the previous video for chapter 1, also in the beginning of this video. But when you do this and you're forming this new identity, you're not achieving goals. You're basically changing yourself, and you're changing your belief in yourself. And that's what's going to cause the positive changes in your life. What's going to bring about these atomic habits or better, more positive habits in your life. And with that, that's going to do it, guys, for this video. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next time. We've got chapter 3. Started doing more Eloquent JS videos. We got one of those out in the previous week, so check that out if for all the computer programmers out there, software developers, etc. And guys, if you have any questions on this video, let me know. Powerful stuff, and you can start to see the lessons in this book already that kind of resonate from other books that we've read. With Winning in Mind comes to mind in particular, maybe The One Thing, even a little bit of Influence, the book by Dr. Robert Cialdini. A little bit of this comes to mind, where we talked about how if something is incongruent, or if you don't do something that's in line with your identity, you feel bad for it, so you start to do it. Kind of reminds me of his idea in the book of reciprocation. And when you don't reciprocate something back to somebody, or when somebody does something nice for you, you want to reciprocate it back because you want to pay somebody back. You don't want to feel like you owe somebody something. So anyway, interesting stuff here, guys. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll be back next time. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.